The Galactic Council gasped, "They're attacking Earth. Are they insane?" The vote that doomed them. The vote was already halfway through when Victor Haas stood up. He did not raise his hand first. He did not wait to be called. He rose from the second tier of the Galactic Council's grand chamber, straightened his jacket, and spoke into the vast open air with the steady voice of a man who had been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years, and who already knew with complete certainty that he was going to lose. "Grand Speaker," he said, "I formally object." The Grand Chamber was large enough to contain most Earth cities. It occupied the upper core of the station Eternal Meridian, which had hung in permanent orbit above a dying neutron star for centuries before humanity had learned to walk upright. 300 elevated tiers curved around a hollow central floor, and every seat in every tier was occupied. The light was blue-white and even. The air carried a faint electrical charge that Victor had spent 11 years learning to ignore. Delegate Orath of the Drathkai Dominion stood at the central podium. He was tall even by Drathkai standards, with pale gray ridges of bone framing his jaw and amber eyes that caught the chamber light like polished coins. He had been speaking for 22 minutes. He had data charts, resource surveys, a military assessment, and the unbroken confidence of someone who had never once been surprised by any outcome he had planned for. "The species in question," Orath had said, "currently occupies a solar system of considerable material value. The third planet alone carries surface and atmospheric isotope deposits classified by the Dominion as Tier 1 critical resources, the kind of materials that can fuel an entire expansion fleet for 30 cycles. The species itself, known as humans, presents no credible obstacle to a structured annexation. Their fleet is comprised of converted transport vessels with limited shielding. Their surface-based weapons are low-yield projectile systems that would not challenge a Drathkai patrol formation. Their orbital infrastructure is observational in nature, not defensive." He had paused at that point and let his gaze move around the chamber. "The annexation of the Saul system presents no meaningful operational risk. It is, in the simplest possible terms, available." Several delegations had laughed. The Silurian junior delegates in the upper tiers had exchanged comments behind their hands. The Belvari Consortium representatives had barely glanced up from their consoles. A pair of Gulari observers near the back had found it entertaining enough to lean forward. Victor Haas had sat through every word with his hands flat on his desk and his face giving nothing away. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with short gray hair and 11 years of experience sitting in rooms where he was the only human and was expected to be grateful for the invitation. He had read Orath's proposal when it first circulated 4 days ago. He had read it 3 times. And then he had made several calls to Earth, and the conversations had confirmed exactly what he already feared. He stood. "Grand Speaker Alun," he said, addressing the ancient Silurian at the head of the chamber, "I am requesting that this motion be tabled, pending a comprehensive review of current intelligence on the Saul system's defensive infrastructure." Grand Speaker Alun was 4,000 years old and moved with the careful deliberateness of something that had decided long ago that almost nothing in the universe was worth rushing. He turned his long, pale head toward Victor. "Your objection is noted, Delegate Haas. Delegate Orath, please respond." Orath turned to face Victor. His expression was patient in the particular way that implied the patience would not last. "Delegate Haas," he said, "we acknowledge that this motion places you in a difficult position. However, this council does not make decisions on the basis of sentiment. The survey data we have presented was independently verified by 3 separate teams. It is current and comprehensive." He paused. "What we are proposing is structured and orderly. Human populations will be protected under Dominion governance frameworks. Their homeworld will be maintained. This is not punitive. It is simply practical." Victor waited until Orath had finished. Then he said, "Your survey data is 6 years old." Orath held his expression. "Surveys of this classification." are conducted once and archived, Victor said, because no species you have ever surveyed changed significantly in 6 years. He kept his voice level and clear. We did. The murmuring in the chamber shifted. Several delegates who had been half present were now fully watching. Your survey teams came to our system, Victor said. They cataloged our research stations. They documented our civilian transports. They noted our weather satellites and our communications relay platforms. They observed everything that was in plain sight. He paused. They did not ask what was inside the largest bodies in our asteroid belt. They did not investigate why our primary orbital platforms were oriented outward rather than inward. They did not examine our deep ocean installations, or ask what the expanded infrastructure on our moon was being used for, or request documentation on 11 separate engineering programs that your teams walked past without querying. He looked directly at Orath. They did not ask, because they assumed the answers would not be interesting. I am here to tell you that assumption was the most expensive mistake the Drathkai Dominion has ever made. The chamber was genuinely quiet now. Even the Belvari traders had stopped looking at their consoles. Orath's jaw tightened very slightly. Is that a threat, delegate? It is a warning, Victor said. Threats come from anger. This comes from knowledge. I am sharing the knowledge freely. What this council chooses to do with it is entirely up to you. The vote was called. Victor had counted the markers 4 days ago. 31 delegates voted in favor of the annexation motion. Victor's was the single vote against. Grand Speaker Alun's marker remained on his desk, untouched. He abstained. His eyes moved to Victor's face for one brief, deliberate moment, and then he looked at the ceiling. The authorization passed. Orath's delegation sent the fleet order within minutes. The Drathkai fleet, 300 warships already positioned at the edge of Dominion space, received their movement command and began the long turn toward the Saul system. 17 galactic days to Earth. Victor gathered his documents, rose from his seat, and walked out of the chamber without speaking to anyone. He had reached the far end of the main corridor when footsteps came from behind him, long and measured and slightly unusual in their pace. He stopped and turned. Grand Speaker Alun stood alone in the corridor. His staff was absent. He had moved quickly for someone his age, and the fact that he had made the effort was not nothing. You were not performing back there, Alun said. No, Victor said. What does this council not know? Victor reached into the inside of his jacket and produced a data chip. Flat, matte black, no markings. He held it out. Alun took it between 2 long fingers and studied it. Read it tonight, Victor said. Read it twice. The first time you will think I am exaggerating. He held the Grand Speaker's gaze. The second time you will understand that I was understating it. He glanced down at the chip in Alun's hand. For 11 years we have sat in that chamber and been assessed and measured and dismissed. We were paying attention to every word. We were studying every species, every system, and every piece of technology we were allowed to observe. And while everyone in that room was busy deciding we were not a serious concern, we were building. He paused. We were building very seriously. Can the fleet be recalled? Alun said. It is already moving, Victor said. Nothing stops now. He held the old Silurian's gaze. Just watch. And when it is over, make certain this council understands exactly what it witnessed. He turned and walked to a small communications room at the end of the corridor. He locked the door. He sat at the terminal. He opened an encrypted channel, routed through 4 relay points, to a single console in a bunker 40 meters beneath the streets of Saul. He typed one word. He pressed send. He sat back and looked at the wall. The word was Kang. In the bunker beneath Saul at 3:14 in the morning, every screen in Dana Ford's operations center lit up simultaneously. She read the single word. She counted 3 seconds. Then she picked up the command line. All stations, she said. This is not a drill. Begin full activation sequence. 17 days. Dana Ford had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours since the transmission arrived, and she had decided that was acceptable. The operations center ran around the clock from the moment the activation code went out. Every section of Earth's unified defense network had a dedicated screen on the main wall, and those screens never went dark. Orbital mechanics, fleet positioning, materials logistics, energy readiness, and communications intercepts all streamed in constant columns of data that updated by the second. Dana moved between stations with a tablet in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other, and she did not raise her voice once in the first 5 days because there was no need. Her staff knew exactly what to do. They had been training for this scenario, this specific and rarely spoken aloud contingency, for the better part of a decade. The number that drove every decision was 17. 17 galactic days, roughly 21 Earth days from the time the signal was sent. The fleet was already moving. There was no diplomatic path remaining, no back-channel negotiation possible. The only variable that still mattered was readiness, and readiness was the one thing Earth had been building toward for years. On day 2, Chief Engineer Nate Cross did something that had never appeared in any Galactic Council record about Earth. He was aboard a structure in the mid-asteroid belt that had been cataloged in official Council survey files as an autonomous resource extraction unit. The description was not entirely false. It did extract minerals, but that function had always been secondary. Nate sat at the central command console, entered a 14-digit authorization code that only 6 people on Earth knew in full, and watched a progress indicator begin moving across his screen. Platform 1 of the Helix grid came online. Then Platform 2. Then 3. The count accelerated into a wave, sweeping east and west from his position across the entire span of the belt, reaching outward toward the Kuiper boundary and inward toward the mid-system corridor. Structures that Drathkai survey teams had documented as mining equipment, relay towers, charging depots, and passive sensor nodes opened their primary systems and powered their weapons. The activation process took 4 hours to complete. When it finished, 4,399 platforms had confirmed operational status. The engineer standing at the station beside Nate watched the activation map fill in and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "We actually built all of them." "Every one," Nate said. He set down his mug. 9 years. Different construction teams working different sectors simultaneously, each group unaware of the full count. No single team ever had enough information to describe the complete system. He looked at the finished map. "Get them moving to their grid coordinates. I want full coverage established by day 8. Each platform carried a directed energy projector operating on a specific frequency, a frequency that no Drathkai warship shielded against, because Drathkai shielding technology had been a matter of publicly available council record for 40 years, and Earth's engineers had spent considerable time studying where the gaps were. The platforms had independent propulsion units borrowed from the same asteroid redirection programs that had been publicly funded for decades. They could move, track, and engage, and to any sensor array that was not specifically designed to find them, they looked like background noise. Aboard the Earth Fleet flagship, the carrier-class vessel Horizon, Admiral Cole Brand gave his war briefing at 600 on day 3. He stood at the head of the briefing room table, looked at the faces of the officers he had served with for most of his professional life, and kept it short. 41 ships against 300, he said. He let the number sit for a moment. "I know what that sounds like. Stop thinking in those terms. We are not meeting them in open space. We are meeting them inside a system that has been specifically modified and equipped for this engagement over the last 11 years. Every significant rock in that belt, every platform in orbit, every deep installation on every moon is part of this fight." He looked around the table. "Our job is not to match them ship for ship. Our job is to make certain there is not a single approach vector in this system that does not cost them more than they expected to pay." No one argued. No one looked uncertain. They had all studied the operational plan. They had run the simulations. They understood that the plan was not built on hope. It was built on 9 years of engineering work that nobody outside Earth's command structure knew existed. General Owen Drake, running ground and orbital forces command from a reinforced installation in the Scottish Highlands, was the most energetic person in any room he occupied during those 17 days. He ran his briefings with the specific intensity of a man who had been waiting 8 years to use the thing he had spent 8 years building. Owen was not anxious. He was impatient. There was a meaningful difference. The Continental Rail Cannon network had been embedded into mountainsides, coastal platforms, and deepwater installations across 6 continents over the course of 8 years. Each cannon was capable of launching a dense tungsten projectile at 12 kilometers per second. At orbital range, the kinetic energy of that impact was equivalent to a tactical warhead, and not a small one. The Galactic Council's survey teams had cataloged several of these installations under the heading of geological research facilities. Owen had personally reviewed that paperwork and had never once found it troubling. On day 7, Dr. Iris Webb presented her tactical analysis to Cole's senior staff. She had spent the week reading, pulling every battle record, engagement analysis, and behavioral profile in Earth's intelligence archives on the Drathkai Dominion. She had cross-referenced it with a xenopsychology paper, a materials conflict study, and a decade-old strategic document written by a retired Earth analyst who had, apparently, considered this specific scenario worth preparing for. Iris stood at the front of the briefing room and said, "The Drathkai win wars by breaking the will of their opponents, not by destroying their armies. Every annexation in their recorded history followed the same sequence. They arrive in overwhelming force. They demonstrate immediate and dramatic capability. They strike targets that carry psychological weight. Then they wait for the subject population to fragment and seek terms." She looked around the room. "They have never fought a species that absorbed serious damage in the opening phase and became more coordinated in response, not less. Their battle doctrine has no category for that pattern. Their training does not prepare their commanders for it. When it happens, and it will happen, they will be inside a tactical framework that gives them no guidance for what they are seeing. That window is what we need to be ready to exploit." Cole looked at her steadily. "How confident are you?" "Completely," she said. "They have never encountered anything like us." The following 10 days were the most precisely organized period in the history of Earth's military coordination. The defense fleet moved into holding positions behind the outer gas giants. Nate's platforms settled into their grid coordinates and powered down to minimum operational signature. Owen's rail systems completed final calibration sequences on every continent. Dana's center processed continuous sensor data from the outer system and routed it to every command level in the network. On the morning of day 14, the fleet was fully in place. On day 15, Nate confirmed that every active Helix platform was dark and undetectable by any standard survey instrument. On day 16, at 3:43 hours, Dana walked into the main operations room and looked at the long-range sensor display. She stood still for a moment, reading the contact signatures beginning to form at the system boundary. Then she said, calmly and without drama, "Contact. 300 signatures at the outer system edge. They are here." The Drathkai fleet had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the very boundary of the Saul system. Their arrival was an enormous event on every sensor array from the Kuiper belt inward, a cascading displacement signature that lit up every monitoring station simultaneously. They were not hiding. It had not occurred to them that hiding was necessary. Aboard his command ship, Fleet Commander Vorith stood at the forward observation deck and studied the pale yellow star at the center of this unremarkable system. He had reviewed the survey data twice during the journey. He had studied the population figures, the military assessment, the resource projections. He had expected to feel very little about this assignment, a clean operation, A brief exercise, back to Dominion space before the quarter ended. His sensors showed him a quiet system. A quiet planet, blue and green and small, sitting in its orbit exactly where the data said it would be. He saw no defense fleet. He registered nothing unusual in the asteroid belt. The third planet's orbital space was still. "Begin the advance," he said. 43 kilometers ahead of his Vanguard's lead ship, the first Helix grid platform powered its systems up, rotated its projector toward the incoming fleet, and locked on. First contact, last mistake. Vorith's Vanguard crossed the outer marker of the asteroid belt at 6:11 hours Earth time, moving in tight formation. 50 ships, the best-equipped forward units in the Dominion's fleet. Their approach vector was clean. Their sensor returns showed nothing worth noting. Every crew member on every ship understood that this was the easy part of a simple assignment. They had gone 43 kilometers into the belt when the first platform fired. The lead destroyer took the shot in its forward shield array. The shield held, but the frequency of the impact was unlike anything the ship's automated defense system had encountered before, and the system spent 0.4 of a second recalibrating. That was enough time for a second platform to fire, and a third, and then the number of incoming contacts became impossible to individually track. The first 90 seconds of the engagement produced a volume of directed fire that Vorith's tactical officer would later describe in the official incident log as without precedent. 17 Drathkai ships were destroyed in those 90 seconds, not disabled, not damaged and retreating. Gone, their energy signatures ending cleanly on the display. The platforms were firing from positions inside rock formations, from below the orbital plane, from angles that no ship-mounted weapon could logically occupy, unless someone had spent years placing them there with exactly this scenario in mind. Vorith ordered his Vanguard to reverse and regroup. The order was transmitted and acknowledged, and then something happened that existed in no tactical record in Drathkai military history. The platforms followed them out of the belt. They came out of the rocks on their own drives, tracking the retreating formation, maintaining engagement distance, and continuing to fire. They were not warships, nothing close to that scale, but they were too numerous to prioritize individually and too mobile to simply outrun on a short vector, and the 50 ships that had entered the belt emerged on the other side at 31. Vorith stared at his display for 4 full seconds without speaking. Then he said quietly, "What are those?" His intelligence officer had no answer. The platforms were not in the survey database. They were not in any records the Dominion held. They had not existed, as far as the Dominion's files were concerned, until 67 seconds ago. Vorith pulled the Vanguard back and redirected his main battle group. 220 ships, the core of the fleet, moved to a wide flanking heading, sweeping around the asteroid belt and arcing behind Jupiter on a classical envelopment path that had worked in 31 prior campaigns across 31 prior systems. The plan was to bypass the belt entirely, come around the gas giant's far side, and approach Earth from the system's southern axis, where the survey data identified the lightest defensive concentration. The survey data had not accounted for Mars. Earth's colony on the fourth planet had been growing for 42 years. Galactic Council records described it as a civilian settlement, a collection of mining operations, research facilities, and low-gravity agriculture projects. What those records did not reflect was that the colony's deep excavated hangars contained 60,000 autonomous drone units, each one roughly the size of a ground transport vehicle, each armed with a short-range energy disruptor, and a reinforced impact frame designed to survive multiple collisions before it lost function. General Owen Drake gave the launch order from Scotland at 7:19 hours. The drones rose from the Martian surface in a continuous, unbroken stream, silent and fast, and invisible to a sensor system calibrated to detect warships. They crossed the gap between Mars and the Jupiter corridor in 40 minutes, spread themselves into a dispersed field pattern across the entire width of the flanking route, and held position. The Drathkai main battle group entered the drone field at full advance speed. The first 6 minutes of that encounter were, by any honest measure, unlike anything Vorith's tactical staff had trained for. The drones did not attack in coordinated formations. They did not move according to any approach pattern that a Drathkai tactical system could model and counter. They attacked individually, from separate vectors, targeting propulsion housings, sensor arrays, and shield generator nodes. When one drone was destroyed, the next in the dispersed field identified the opening left behind and filled it. The Drathkai warships were designed and built for fleet engagements, configured to face threats on the same scale as themselves. They had no established response for 60,000 small, numerous, individually persistent targets that did not coordinate in any way the doctrine anticipated. The flanking advance lost 40 ships and its formation integrity before it cleared the drone field. What came through on the far side was a disorganized battle group that needed hours to reform, and those hours were not available. Vorith redirected everything he had remaining toward Earth orbit directly. 152 ships, moving on a straight heading now, abandoning tactical maneuvering in favor of raw momentum. He needed to reach the planet. Once in orbit, he could demonstrate the kind of sustained orbital pressure that had ended every conflict the Dominion had ever prosecuted. No species in the recorded history of Drathkai expansion had continued organized resistance past a sustained orbital engagement. This was the stage where opposition collapsed. This had always been the stage where opposition collapsed. He reached Earth's orbital shell at 1330 hours and ordered bombardment to begin. The surface fired back. The first salvo from Earth's rail cannon network came from installations on 4 separate continents simultaneously. 12 tungsten rounds, each moving at 12 kilometers per second, traveled from the planet's surface to orbital altitude in under a minute. 2 Drathkai heavy cruisers were struck before their crews had registered that the fire originated from the ground. The Dominion's tactical doctrine categorized surface weapons as a secondary consideration, something to address after orbital control was secured. No species in the Drathkai's history had ever hit a vessel at orbital altitude from a surface-based kinetic launcher moving at that velocity. No tactical planner had considered it worth modeling. The second surface salvo followed 9 minutes after the first, then a third. Then Colbrand brought the Earth fleet out from the shadow of the outer system at 1407 hours, and the engagement in low Earth orbit became the most complex close-range fleet battle the region had ever seen. Cole's 41 ships were faster and more maneuverable than anything Vorith had brought. They had been designed and refined over a decade for one specific purpose, fighting a numerically superior force at close orbital range, where the size advantage of a larger warship becomes a problem rather than a benefit. The pilots aboard those ships had run this exact scenario in simulation more times than most of them could accurately count. Vorith's crews had run nothing comparable, because nothing comparable had ever been considered necessary before. The engagement ran at full intensity for 9 hours. It was not a clean victory. Cole lost 6 ships in those 9 hours, and every loss was real and final and felt by every person on the Horizon's bridge. But the Drathkai losses were continuous. By hour 6, Vorith's fleet had lost its operational structure. Individual ships were responding to immediate threats in isolation rather than functioning as a coordinated force, which was precisely the condition Cole's plan had been designed to produce. At hour 8, 3 of Vorith's destroyers were boarded. This was the moment that Vorith, watching the internal hull camera feeds recovered from one of the lost ships, understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong with every assumption his command had made about this species. The boarding teams were small, 12 to 15 personnel per action. Entering through hull access points created by compact cutting equipment that no survey had ever recorded. They moved through the Drathkai destroyer's interior corridors in a way that matched no tactical doctrine Vorith recognized. They did not advance in uniform formation. They communicated constantly in short, rapid exchanges, and they changed direction and approach based on those communications in real time. When 3 Drathkai soldiers held a corridor against a 2-person approach, a third team member moved through the ship's internal infrastructure above them and arrived from a direction that should not have been viable. It was improvised. It was relentless. And it took less than 30 minutes to disable all 3 destroyers from the inside. Vorith had been in military service for 40 years. He had never watched an enemy board one of his ships and succeed. At hour 9, he sent a ceasefire request. Dana Ford received it in the operations center. She read it, set it on her desk, and connected directly to Ambassador Jade Ellis, who had been in a secure diplomatic room for the last 11 hours. Jade was 38 years old, a career diplomat with 6 years of council experience. She read the ceasefire request. She read it a second time. Then she typed her response herself without consulting anyone. Unconditional and complete withdrawal of all Drathkai forces from the Saul system. Full financial reparations for all damage sustained. Vorith himself to appear before the Galactic Council in person within 30 days. She sent it, then she sat back and waited. On the Drathkai command ship, Vorith read the message. He read it again. He set it flat on the console in front of him. He said nothing for a very long time. He had expected many things when this campaign began. He had not expected to be the one requesting terms, and he had not, under any circumstances, expected to be told no. The council watches the replay. Grand Speaker Alun called the emergency session before the final phase of the engagement had even fully concluded. The data had been arriving at eternal meridian for hours before the ceasefire request was transmitted. Sensor reports, energy signature logs, intercepted fleet communications, and footage from 17 observation buoys maintained by various council member states in the outer Saul system for administrative purposes had been streaming into the station's data center since the first Helix platform activated. By the time the Drathkai fleet began its disorganized withdrawal from Earth's orbit, Alun had already seen enough to understand that what had occurred was not a setback, not an upset, and not anything that the Council's existing frameworks had a proper category for. The session was called for the following morning. Every delegation attended in person. No absences, no proxy votes, no senior representatives sending junior staff in their place. The chamber was full in a way it had not been in a decade, and the quality of the silence before Alun opened the session was the silence of a room where nobody was entirely sure what they were about to be shown. Alun opened without preamble. He ordered the battle footage to be played on the central display. The compiled footage ran for just over 2 hours. It had been assembled from all 17 observation buoys and 3 recovered Drathkai hull cameras, cross-referenced with sensor logs to produce a complete sequential record of the engagement from first contact to ceasefire. Every phase was present. The Kuiper belt ambush, the drone field absorbing and breaking the flanking advance, Earth's surface returning orbital fire, Cole's fleet moving at close range with a coordination and precision that was difficult to reconcile with what the survey data had described. 3 Drathkai warships boarded and disabled by small teams of humans who had decided, in the middle of an active orbital engagement, that the fastest route to ending a ship's threat was to go inside it and remove the threat directly. Nobody spoke during the footage. Nobody laughed. The chamber was quiet in a way that it had never been quiet during any session Victor Haas could remember attending. When the footage concluded and Alun opened the floor, Delegate Orath, who had proposed the annexation, was the first to speak. He sat in his tier with his expression fully controlled and said that the footage could not be independently verified, that the observation buoys were distributed through a region where data manipulation was technically possible, that an independent review process should be initiated before the council drew conclusions. The observation buoys, Victor Haas said from his tier before anyone else could respond, belong to 17 different council member states, including 4 that maintain no diplomatic relationship with Earth. He placed the verification documentation on the chamber's shared display. The recordings are cross-validated across all 17 independent sources. The sensor logs correspond without discrepancy. The footage is genuine. Orath said nothing further. The debate that followed was unlike any session in the Council's modern era. Species that had laughed at Earth's provisional membership 2 weeks prior were holding intense, private conversations with their advisors. The Silurian senior delegation, who had collectively witnessed more recorded history than any other civilization in the room, convened an internal conference that lasted 40 minutes before their lead representative spoke publicly. The Gulari observers, who had been silent in council sessions for 6 years, asked to be recognized, and when acknowledged, stood and formally requested a review of Earth species classification from Tier 2, emerging to a category that more accurately reflected the demonstrated evidence. Several delegations immediately seconded the request. Others seconded it more quietly, through notes rather than public statements, but seconded it nonetheless. A classified report from the Council's own Xenopsychology Division arrived in a Lund's office during the midday recess. Through a process that everyone understood was intentional and that nobody officially discussed, the report's findings became accessible to most senior delegation members by the afternoon. The core conclusion was direct. This species does not respond to existential pressure with fragmentation, surrender, or the seeking of terms. It responds with increased coordination and accelerated capability development. No behavioral model currently in the Council's reference database accounts for this pattern in its observed form. The pattern appears structural, embedded deeply in the species' long history rather than situational. We have no reliable method for estimating the upper limit of this response. The report was 4 pages. It had been written in 36 hours by 5 xenopsychologists who had apparently not slept during that period. Ambassador Jade Ellis arrived at Eternal Meridian on the 3rd day after the battle ended. She brought 2 staff members with her. She also brought Admiral Colbrand and General Owen Drake, and neither man had changed out of the field uniform he had been wearing during the engagement. Cole had a faint burn mark on the left sleeve of his jacket from a console that had overloaded on the horizon during the orbital phase. Owen's boots carried the marks of 3 days of constant movement across a command post floor. They had traveled directly from active duty positions. They had not stopped to change. This was a deliberate choice, and everyone in the chamber understood it without being told. When the 3 of them walked through the grand chamber entrance for the public session, the room noticed. Every tier noticed. What they noticed specifically was 2 military officers in worn field gear standing without ceremony beside the ambassador, and the message communicated by that image required no translation in any language used in the council. Jade addressed the chamber from the central podium. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She used no dramatic language. She stated that Earth was formally revising the terms of its council membership from provisional status to full sovereign membership, effective immediately and without negotiation, and that any future military action directed against the Saul system would be treated by Earth and all of its defense partners as an act of war warranting a collective response. She then announced that in the 18 months preceding the Drathkai campaign, Earth had quietly concluded mutual defense agreements with 11 other Council member species. The majority of them were small civilizations. Most had been members of the Council for longer than many of the current major powers. Several had spent decades on the margins of Council proceedings, overlooked by the larger powers in the room. She named each one. The names were not surprising to anyone who had been paying close attention. They were a significant surprise to the majority of delegates who had not been. The chamber reacted with a noise that Alun let run for 30 seconds before calling order. Orath's delegation had gone very still. Victor Haas sat in his tier and watched the room. He had nothing further to say. He had said everything necessary weeks ago. Vorath appeared before the council on the 4th day. His own dominion had removed him from command before the session, calculating that placing him before the council process was a less costly outcome than facing collective accountability for the campaign. He sat in the respondent's position on the chamber floor and answered questions from delegates for 3 hours with the composed, careful manner of someone who had spent several days accepting how thoroughly every assumption he had made had been wrong. After the session concluded and the chamber emptied, Cole Brand moved through the corridor outside the chamber on his way back to the transit dock. He heard footsteps slow behind him and turned. Vorath was standing in the corridor. He looked at Cole with the expression of a man who had processed 40 years of military culture about what it meant to face someone who had defeated you, and who was now waiting to receive whatever came next. Cole looked at him. He held the eye contact for 1 second. He nodded once, a single brief acknowledgement that carried no particular meaning except that it had been given, and walked on. Vorath stood in the empty corridor and watched him go. He found, in a way he could not fully organize into words, that the nod bothered him more than anything else the humans had done during the entire engagement. That evening, as the session formally closed and delegates dispersed through the station's common areas, a young Silurian representative approached Victor in the corridor outside the main chamber entrance. He was 500 years old, barely past the beginning of his career by Silurian standards, and he carried the expression of someone who had just finished reading something that changed the shape of what he thought he understood. "Delegate Haas," he said, "the grid platforms, the drones from the 4th planet, the surface launch systems, the boarding teams." He paused. "Is there more? Systems that were not used, capabilities that this council has not seen demonstrated?" Victor looked at the young delegate for a moment. Then he said, "What you saw was the response we prepared for the scenario we considered most likely." He held the young delegate's gaze. "We build responses for a great many scenarios." The young Silurian was still standing in the corridor, thinking carefully about that, when Victor turned the corner and was gone. What they left behind. 6 months after the battle above Earth, the Saul system looked, to any external observer arriving without prior knowledge, almost exactly as it had before the engagement. The asteroid belt was quiet. Earth's surface was intact. The orbital platforms were back in their positions. The fleet was in port. The planet turned on its axis and went about its business. Almost exactly, not quite. The differences were visible on close examination. 412 Helix grid platforms had been destroyed during the engagement. Nate Cross had spent the first week after the battle not in any celebration, but in the operations room of Platform 1, reviewing every engagement log from every destroyed unit, cataloging each loss against the tactical timeline, and building the technical specifications for the replacements. The new specifications were 30% improved across every performance category. Nate wanted them operational within 8 months. His team said 10 was the realistic estimate. He said 8. They discussed it at length and settled on 9, and then the actual construction rate put the project on track for 7.5, because Nate's team had the specific relationship with scheduled deadlines that treated the deadline as a challenge to be surpassed rather than a boundary to be respected. Cole Brand attended the first 3 post-battle analysis sessions in full. These sessions were not celebrations. They were exhaustive, honest, and occasionally uncomfortable examinations of every phase of the engagement, with deliberate focus on where things had nearly gone wrong. 6 Earth ships had been lost. 31 crew members had been lost with them. These numbers were not referred to in any document or any discussion as acceptable costs or necessary outcomes. They were referred to as gaps, specific points in the plan where different decisions might have produced different results, where the next version of the plan needed to be better. Cole ran those sessions in the same way he ran everything else, direct, clear, and entirely without self-congratulation. Outside those sessions, he had considerably less time than he had anticipated. The 11 species that had signed the Mutual Defense Compact were now asking detailed questions about how the compact would function in practice. What did the command structure look like? What were Earth's specific response obligations? What resources could partner species contribute? 3 additional species had submitted formal membership inquiries within 60 days of the battle ending, each one citing the engagement as its primary reason for interest. Cole found himself in diplomatic meetings 4 days a week, working alongside Jade Ellis to construct, from the ground up, a multilateral defense structure that had no direct precedent in the Council's history. He had not expected to spend his time this way. He was not convinced he was naturally suited to diplomacy, but Jade told him, plainly and without softening it, that the reason these other civilizations wanted Earth specifically at the table was not his diplomatic skill. It was the fact that they had watched what happened in Saul's system orbit, and they wanted to be on the same side as the people who had done it. Cole found that reasoning workable. Iris Webb did not wait for the compact negotiations to begin her own work. 3 weeks after the battle concluded, she submitted a formal research proposal to Earth Science Council for a comprehensive xenobiological study of the Drathkai Dominion. The proposal was approved in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. The Drathkai Dominion, still navigating its political situation following the failed campaign, received her initial contact letter with a mixture of confusion and, in several academic quarters, open puzzlement. A species whose planet their government had attempted to take was now proposing to study them academically, with genuine enthusiasm, and without conditions attached. Iris arrived in Drathkai space with a team of 8 researchers 7 weeks after the battle. She spent the first 2 days in formal meetings with Drathkai academic counterparts, who arrived prepared for the interaction to be adversarial in some form. She spent those 2 days asking questions about cellular regeneration rates in cold climate population groups, the neurological basis for the Drathkai's collective tactical coordination instinct, and whether their astronomical research institutions maintained records of pre-spaceflight observational history. By the end of the 2nd day, the Drathkai researchers at the table were answering with something that resembled genuine professional interest. One of them said, during a break between sessions, "Your government just finished fighting ours, and you came here to study our biology." "Your government made a decision," Iris said. "Your biology did not. I am here for your biology." She looked at him directly. "You are, for the record, one of the most structurally interesting species I have encountered in 11 years of research. Your cellular repair mechanisms alone represent several years of productive study. I would prefer not to waste that." He considered this for a moment. Then he said, "That is a very unusual way to approach what just happened between our peoples." "We have a word for the approach," Iris said, "pragmatic." He thought about that. Then he agreed to the first formal research session. The session ran 4 hours longer than scheduled. Dana Ford's work in the months following the battle was less visible than almost anything else happening in Earth's institutions, and considerably more unsettling. The intelligence recovered from the 3 boarded Drathkai destroyers had taken weeks to fully process. Most of the recovered data was expected content: tactical deployment logs, navigation records, fleet communications, crew activity files. Useful material, properly categorized and filed. Dana had moved through it methodically and without surprises until the 44th day after the battle. When a junior analyst named Will flagged an anomaly, in a subset of command-level communications from the 8 weeks preceding the campaign's launch. Dana reviewed the flagged material personally that evening. The anomaly was a series of 7 communications, all originating from the same relay point in neutral space, all addressed to a specific communications node embedded within Drathkai High Command. Taken individually, the content of each message was not unusual. Strategic assessments, resource projections, political analysis regarding the Saul system, standard advisory communications. But every single assessment was wrong in the same direction. Every resource projection overstated the ease of the operation. Every piece of political analysis concluded that the campaign carried minimal risk. Every evaluation of Earth's defensive capability described it as negligible. The messages had been composed specifically and consistently to make the Drathkai confident enough to authorize the campaign without additional investigation. Confident enough to rely on survey data that was 6 years old. Confident enough to send 300 ships into a system they had not genuinely studied. The relay point of origin was not a Drathkai location. It was not any Earth location. It was not anything Dana's system could match against the Council's open navigational records or any of the member state databases she held access to. She ran the relay signature through every database Earth's intelligence division maintained. She ran it through 3 Council-affiliated archives. She ran it through 2 of NATE's external sensor databases that were not technically accessible from her terminal but were, because she and Nate had an arrangement from 3 years ago that neither of them had ever documented. The signature matched nothing on record. It corresponded to a location that appeared in no navigational database Earth held access to. And the communications were not limited to the weeks before the campaign. Tracing the signature backward through recovered Drathkai archives, the relay had been active for years, sending a steady and consistent stream of information about Earth into Drathkai High Command, each piece designed to build and reinforce the same conclusion: that humanity was not dangerous, that the Saul system was easy, that the operation would be brief. Someone had been shaping the Drathkai's understanding of Earth for years before the campaign was ever proposed. Someone had worked carefully and patiently to ensure that, when the opportunity arose, the Drathkai would take it. Someone had wanted this specific war to happen, had invested years of effort into making it happen, and had done all of it without leaving any trace in any record that Earth's intelligence division had known to look for. Someone had wanted Earth and the Drathkai to destroy each other. The Drathkai had failed to deliver on that expectation, which meant whoever had arranged it knew the outcome, and if they were still watching, they knew Earth had found the trail. Dana sat with the full picture for 2 days. Then she brought it to Cole in his office at the horizon's docked position and laid it out plainly in sequence, without editorializing. Cole read the report. He read it a second time. He looked out the office window for a while without speaking. Then he said, "How old is the oldest message in the chain?" 14 years, Dana said. 3 years before Earth submitted its council membership application. Cole looked at her. They were watching us before we even entered that room. Yes. And their intended outcome was mutual destruction. Earth and the Drathkai, both removed as factors. That is how I read it. Cole was quiet for another moment. The plan failed. They know it failed. If they've been watching as long as this evidence suggests, they know we found the relay trail. They may already be planning something different. That is also how I read it, Dana said. Then we need to find them, Cole said, before they decide what different looks like. Dana nodded. She had already begun. She had 20 analysts working the relay signature in continuous rotation, divided into 4 separate research threads so that no single failure point could halt all progress simultaneously. She had reached out to 2 compact partner species, whose long-range sensor capabilities extended well beyond Earth's current range, and both had agreed to share archival deep space data without asking why she was interested in it. She was not going to find the answer quickly. Whatever had been operating here had worked carefully and invisibly for a very long time. But Dana had been in the intelligence profession for 16 years, and her experience had given her one consistent and reliable conclusion. Nothing operating in space left absolutely no trace. Data had edges. Signals had origins. Patient and methodical work found them. It always found them eventually. She went back to her office and returned to the trail. 3 months after the battle, Grand Speaker Alun cleared his schedule for an entire afternoon and sat alone in his private chambers on Eternal Meridian with the data chip Victor Haas had given him in the corridor outside the Grand Chamber. He had read it the night it was handed to him, as Victor had asked. He had read it a second time, as Victor had predicted he would need to. Now he read it a third time, slowly and without any interruption, taking notes on a physical page beside him. The chip contained 11 years of Earth strategic development record. There were gaps where information had been withheld, but what it contained was sufficient. Engineering programs organized by phase and year, research initiatives cross-referenced by department and outcome, political consolidation records, defense infrastructure development timelines, personnel training logs, simulation records, a population-wide psychological resilience study conducted across 8 years, and a forward threat analysis document dated 9 years ago that described, with a level of accuracy that Alun found difficult to sit with, the exact political process by which a larger galactic power might choose to target a recently admitted provisional member with no established alliances, no demonstrated military credibility, and no institutional weight. Every file carried a creation date. Alun studied the dates carefully. The earliest file in the archive predated Earth's Council membership application by 4 years. They had been planning for this before they arrived. They had entered the Council already prepared for the possibility that entering would attract the wrong kind of attention. And in the 11 years since, they had sat in the chamber being catalogued and assessed and dismissed, and in all of that time they had never stopped building, never adjusted the plan, never sought reassurance from any outside source, and never told anyone. Not because they were hostile. Because they understood, in a way that Alun was only now fully appreciating, that the universe did not wait for anyone to be ready. Near the end of the chip, past all the operational and strategic material, there was a file that was different from everything else. It was short. It was not a report or a plan or an analysis. It was a letter, written by hand and scanned into the record. The handwriting was Korean. The translation at the bottom of the page read, "We have been watching the stars for a very long time. We always believed someone was coming. We were never certain of when. We built this for the day we would need it. We hope it is enough. We believe it will be." Alun sat with the letter for a long time. He looked at the wall of his chambers. Then he set the chip down, reached for his communicator, and placed a call to his chief of intelligence. When the call connected, he said, "I need you to reallocate resources, comprehensive study, full scope, infrastructure, engineering programs, psychological frameworks, cultural history, decision-making patterns, the complete picture." He paused. "Not a survey, a genuine study. Start from the beginning and do not skip anything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Which species, Grand Speaker?" Alun looked at the letter on his desk. "Humans," he said. "We should have done this 11 years ago." On Earth, in the late afternoon of a clear autumn day, Admiral Cole Brand stood on a cliff above the sea outside the city of Busan and watched the light change across the water. The sun was low. The sky had turned the specific shade of deep orange that lasted about 10 minutes before full dark arrived. The wind off the ocean was cold enough that he had his collar turned up. He had not stood still in an empty space for longer than 3 consecutive minutes in 4 months. He was not sure the next 4 months would be any different. There was too much being built. Too many structures being established. Too much work still ahead before the unknown thing Dana had found made its next move. He had come out here alone and without notice to anyone, which meant this would probably last another few minutes before someone sent a message. He was not wrong about that. His communicator buzzed. He looked at the screen. 3 notifications. The first was from Jade. 2 new compact membership applications had been received from species that had not been on anyone's list of likely candidates 3 months ago, both requiring formal response within the week. The second was from Nate. Platform production status as of day 201 was ahead of the revised schedule. 914 replacement units confirmed operational, and in position, 2,400 more in active construction across 6 separate manufacturing sites. The third was from Dana, marked with a priority indicator, referencing new findings in the relay signature investigation. Cole looked at the 3 messages. Then he looked back at the water. The orange in the sky was deepening toward dark at the edges. He watched it for 10 more seconds, counting them deliberately. Then he turned away from the cliff, put the communicator in his pocket, and walked back toward his car. There was work to do.